Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm gonna finish up chapter 8. So I'm on page 146 at Burgoyne's blundering invasion. In 1777, London officials adopted an intricate scheme for capturing the vital Hudson River Valley. If successful, the British would sever New England from the rest of the states and paralyze the American cause. The main invading force, under an actor, playwright, soldier, General John Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, would push down the Lake Champlain route from Canada. General Howe's troops in New York, if needed, could advance up the Hudson River to meet Burgoyne near Albany. A third and much smaller British force, commanded by Colonel Barry St. Leger, would come in from the west by way of Lake Ontario and the Mohawk Valley. British planners did not reckon with General Benedict Arnold. After his repulse at Quebec in 1775, he had retreated slowly along the St. Lawrence River back to the Lake Champlain area, by heroic efforts keeping an army in the field. The British had pursued his tattered force to Lake Champlain in 1776, but they could not move farther south until they had won control of the lake, which, in the absence of roads, was indispensable for carrying their supplies. While the British stopped to construct a sizable fleet, the tireless Arnold assembled and fitted out every floatable vessel. His tiny flotilla was finally destroyed after desperate fighting, but time, if not the battle, had been won. Winter was descending, and the British were forced to retire to Canada. General Burgoyne had to start anew from this base the following year. If Arnold had not contributed his daring and skill, the British invaders of 1776 almost certainly would have captured Fort Ticonderoga. If Burgoyne had started from the Springboard in 1776 instead of from Montreal, he almost certainly would have succeeded in his venture. At last, the apparently futile American invasion of Canada in 1775 was beginning to pay rich dividends. General Burgoyne began his fateful invasion with 7,000 regular troops. He was encumbered by a heavy baggage train and a considerable number of women, many of whom were wives of his officers. Progress was painfully slow, for sweaty axemen had to chop a path through the forest, while American militiamen began to gather like hornets on Burgoyne's flanks. General Howe, meanwhile, was causing astonished eyebrows to raise. At a time when it seemed obvious that he should be starting up the Hudson River from New York to join his slowly advancing colleague, he deliberately embarked with the main British army for an attack on Philadelphia, the rebel capital. As scholars now know, he wanted to force a general engagement with Washington's army, destroy it, and leave the path wide open for Burgoyne's thrust. Howe apparently assumed that he had ample time to assist Burgoyne directly, should he be needed. General Washington, keeping a wary eye on the British in New York, hastily transferred his army to the vicinity of Philadelphia. There, late in 1775, he was defeated in 2 pitched battles at Brandywine Creek and Germantown. Pleasure-loving General Howe then settled down comfortably in the lively capital, leaving Burgoyne to flounder through the wilds of the upper New York. Benjamin Franklin, recently sent to Paris as an envoy, truthfully jested that Howe had not captured Philadelphia, but that Philadelphia had captured Howe. Washington finally retired to winter quarters at Valley Forge, a strong, hilly position some 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. There, his frostbitten and hungry men were short of about anything except misery. This rabble was nevertheless whipped into a professional army by the recently arrived Prussian drill master, the profane but patient Baron von Steuben. Burgoyne, meanwhile, had begun to bog down the north of Albany, while a host of American militiamen, scenting the kill, swarmed about him. In a series of sharp engagements, in which General Arnold was again shot in the leg at Quebec, the British army was trapped. Meanwhile, the Americans had driven back St. Leger's force at Oriskany. Unable to advance or retreat, Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire command at Saratoga on October 17, 1777, to the American General Horatio Gates. Saratoga ranks high among the decisive battles of both American and world history. The victory eventually revived the faltering colonial cause. Even more important, it made possible the urgently needed foreign aid from France, which in turn helped ensure American independence. Revolution and diplomacy. France, thirsting for revenge against Britain, was eager to inflame the quarrel that had broken out in America. Stripped of its North American colonies, Britain would presumably seize a front-rank power. France might then regain its former position and prestige, the loss of which in the recent 7 Years' War ranked deeply. For their part, the American revolutionaries badly needed help in the struggle to throw off the British yoke. The stage seemed set for the embattled new nation to take its diplomatic debut by sealing an alliance with France against the common British foe. Yet just as they stood for revolutionary political ideas at home, the rebellious Americans also harbored revolutionary ideas about international affairs. They wanted an end to colonialism and mercantilism. They strongly supported free trade and freedom of the seas. They hoped to substitute the rule of law for the ancient reliance on raw power to arbitrate the affairs of nations. When the new republic's Great Seal proclaimed a new order for the ages, Novus Ordo Seculiorum in Latin, the sentiment was meant to apply to international as well as domestic affairs. The Continental Congress in the summer of 1776 had accordingly drafted a model treaty to guide the American commissioners it was about to dispatch to the French court. One of the treaty chief's authors, John Adams, described its basic principles. 1. No political connection. 2. No military connection. 3. Only a commercial connection. For a nation struggling to secure its very existence, these were remarkably self-denying restrictions, yet they represented an emerging school of thought, popular among enlightened figures in both Europe and America, that deemed history to have reached a momentous turning point when military conflict would be abandoned and the bonds of mutual commercial interest would guarantee peaceful relations among states. Many critics then and later have derided this dream of an imminent golden age as hopelessly naive and impractically utopian, yet it infused an element of idealism into American attitudes toward international affairs that has proved stubbornly persistent. When wily old Benjamin Franklin arrived in Paris to negotiate the treaty with France, he was determined that his very appearance should herald the diplomatic revolution the Americans hoped to achieve. In his clothing and demeanor, he affected a persona that deliberately violated every norm of diplomatic behavior. Instead of the customary ceremonial sword, he toted only a plain white walking stick. Forsaking ermined robes and fancy wigs, he sported homespun garments and a simple cap of marten fur. "Figure me," he wrote to a friend, "very plainly dressed, wearing my thin gray straight hair that peeps out under my only coiffure, a fine fur cap, which comes down my forehead almost to my spectacles. Think how this must appear among the powdered heads of Paris." He shocked the royal court, besotted as it was with pomp and protocol, but ordinary Parisians adored him as a specimen of new democratic social order, devoid of pretense and ornament. When Franklin embraced and kissed the famed French philosopher Voltaire in a Paris theater, the spectators applauded wildly. Meanwhile, the diplomatic game intensified. After the humiliation at Saratoga in 1777, the British Parliament belatedly passed a measure that, in effect, offered the Americans home rule within the empire. This was essentially all that the colonials had ever asked for, except independence. If the French were going to break up the British Empire, they would have to bestir themselves. Franklin now played skillfully on the French fears of Anglo-American reconciliation. On February 6, 1778, France offered the Americans a treaty of alliance. It did not conform exactly to the terms of the model treaty Franklin had brought with him, an early example of practical self-interest trumping abstract idealism in America's conduct of foreign affairs. Against its better judgment, the young republic concluded its first entangling military alliance and would soon regret it. But the treaty with France also constituted an official recognition of America's independence and lent powerful military heft to the patriot cause. Both allies bound themselves to wage war until the United States had fully secured its freedom and until both agreed to terms with common enemy. With those pledges, the American Revolutionary War now became a world war. The Colonial War becomes a wider war. England and France thus came to blows in 1778, and the shot fired at Lexington rapidly widened into a global conflagration. Spain entered the fray against Britain in 1779, as did Holland. Combined Spanish and French fleets outnumbered those of Britain, and on 2 occasions the British Isles seemed to be at the mercy of hostile warships. The weak maritime neutrals of Europe, who had suffered from Britain's dominance over the seas, now began to demand more respect for their rights. In 1780, the imperious Catherine the Great of Russia took the lead in organizing the Armed Neutrality, a lineup of almost all the remaining European neutrals in an attitude of passive hostility toward Britain. She later sneeringly called this armed nullity. The war was now being fought not only in Europe and North America, but also in South America, the Caribbean, and Asia. To say that America, with some French aid, defeated Britain is like saying, "Daddy and I killed the bear." To Britain, struggling for its very life, the scuffle in the New World became secondary. The Americans deserve credit for having kept the war going until 1778, with secret French aid, but they did not achieve their independence until the conflict erupted into a multi-power world war that was too big for Britain to handle. From 1778 to 1783, France provided the rebels with guns, money, immense amounts of equipment, and about 1/2 of America's regular armed forces, and practically all of the new nation's naval strength. France's entrance into the conflict forced the British to change their basic strategy in America. Hitherto, they could not count on Hitherto, they could count on blockading the colonial coast and commanding the seas. Now the French had powerful fleets in American waters, chiefly to protect their own valuable West Indies islands, but in a position to jeopardize Britain's blockade and lines of supply. The British, therefore, decided to evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate their strength in New York City. In June 1778, the withdrawing redcoats were attacked by General Washington at Monmouth, New Jersey, and on a blisteringly hot day. Scores of men collapsed or died from sunstroke, but the battle was indecisive and the British escaped to New York, although about one-third of their Hessians deserted. Henceforth, except for Yorktown interlude of 1781, Washington remained in the New York area, hemming in the British. Wow. Sorry. Excuse me. Blow and counterblow. In the summer of 1780, a powerful French army of 6,000 regular troops, commanded by the Comte de Rochambeau, arrived in Newport, Rhode Island. The Americans were somewhat suspicious of their former enemies. In fact, several ugly flare-ups involving minor bloodshed had already occurred between the new allies, but French had gold and goodwill melted hard hearts. Dancing parties were arranged with the prim Puritan maidens. One French officer related, doubtless with exaggeration, the simple innocence of the Garden of Eden prevailed. No real military advantage came immediately from this French reinforcement, although preparations were made for a Franco-American attack on New York. Improving American morale was staggered later in 1780 when General Benedict Arnold turned traitor. A leader of undoubted dash and brilliance, he was ambitious, greedy, unscrupulous, and suffering from a well-grounded but petulant feeling that his valuable services were not fully appreciated. He plotted with the British to sell out the key stronghold of West Point, which commanded the Hudson River, for £6,300 and an officer's commission. But the sheerest accident, the plot was detected in the nick of time, and Arnold fled to the British. "Whom can we trust now?" cried General Washington in anguish. The British, meanwhile, had devised a plan to roll up the colonies, beginning with the South, where the Loyalists were numerous. The colony of Georgia was ruthlessly overrun in 1778 to 1779. Charleston, South Carolina, fell in 1780. The surrender of the city to the British involved the capture of 5,000 men and 400 cannon and was a heavier loss to the Americans in relation to the existing strength than that of Burgoyne was to the British. Warfare now intensified in the Carolinas, where patriots bitterly fought for their Loyalist neighbors. It was not uncommon for prisoners on both sides to be butchered in cold blood after they had thrown down their arms. The tide turned later in 1780 and early in 1781, when American riflemen wiped out a British detachment at Kings Mountain and then defeated a smaller force at Cowpens. In the Carolina campaign of 1781, General Nathanael Greene, a Quaker-reared tactician, distinguished himself by his strategy of delay. Standing and then retreating, he exhausted his foe, General Charles Cornwallis, in vain pursuit. By losing battles but winning campaigns, the fighting Quaker finally succeeded in clearing most of Georgia and South Carolina of British troops. The land frontier and the sea frontier. The West was ablaze during much of the war. Indian allies of George III, hoping to protect their land, were busy with torch and tomahawk. They were egged on by British agents branded as their hair buyers because they paid bounties for American scalps. Fateful 1771 was known as the Bloody Year on the frontier. Although two nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras, sided with the Americans, the Senecas, Mohawks, Cayugas, and Onondagas joined the British. They were urged on by Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, a convert to Anglicanism who believed, not without reason, that a victorious Britain would restrain American expansion into the West. Brant and the British ravaged large areas of backcountry Pennsylvania and New York until checked by an American force in 1779. In 1784, the pro-British Iroquois were forced to sign the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the first treaty between the United States and an Indian nation. Under its terms, the Indians ceded most of their land. Yet even in wartime, the human tide of westward-moving pioneers did not halt its flow. Eloquent testimony is provided by place names in Kentucky, such as Lexington and Louisville. In the wild Illinois country, the British were especially vulnerable to attack, for they held only scattered posts that they had captured from the French, and audacious frontiersman George Rogers Clark conceived the idea of seizing these forts by surprise. In 1778 to 1779, he floated down the Ohio River with about 175 men and captured in quick succession the forts Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. Clark's admirers have argued, without positive proof, that his success forced the British to cede the region north of the Ohio River to the United States at the peace table in Paris. America's infant navy had meanwhile been laying the foundations of a brilliant tradition. The naval establishment consisted of only a handful of nondescript ships, commanded by daring officers, the most famous of whom was a hard-fighting young Scotsman, John Paul Jones. As events turned out, this tiny naval force never made a real dent in Britain's thunderous fleets. Its chief contribution was in destroying British merchant shipping and thus carrying the war into the waters around the British Isles. More numerous and damaging than ships of the regular American Navy were swift privateers. These craft were privately owned armed ships, legalized pirates in a sense, specifically authorized by Congress to prey on enemy shipping. Altogether, over 1,000 American privateers, responding to the call of patriotism and profit, sailed forth with about 70,000 men, sailors of fortune. They captured some 600 British prizes, while British warships captured about as many as American merchantmen and privateers. Privateering was not an unallied asset. It had the unfortunate effect of diverting manpower from the main war effort and involving Americans, including Benedict Arnold, in speculation and graft. But the privateers brought in urgently needed gold, harassed the enemy, and raised American morale by providing victories at a time when victories were few. British shipping was so badly riddled by privateers and by regular American Navy that insurance rates skyrocketed. Merchant ships were compelled to sail in convoy, and British shippers and manufacturers brought increasing pressure on Parliament to end the war on honorable terms. Yorktown and the final curtain. One of the darkest periods of the war was 1780 to 1781, for the last decisive victory. Inflation of the currency continued at full gallop. The government, virtually bankrupt, declared that it would repay many of its debts at the rate of only 2.5 cents on the dollar. Despair prevailed, the sense of unity withered, and mutinous sentiments infected the army. Meanwhile, the British General Cornwallis was blundering into a trap. After futile operations in Virginia, he had fallen back to the Chesapeake Bay at Yorktown to await seaborne supplies and reinforcements. He assumed Britain would continue to control the sea, but these few fateful weeks happened to be one of the brief periods during the war when British naval superiority slipped away. The French were now prepared to cooperate energetically in a brilliant stroke. Admiral de Grasse, operating with a powerful fleet in the West Indies, advised the Americans that he was free to join with them on an assault on Cornwallis at Yorktown. Quick to seize this opportunity, General Washington made a swift march of more than 300 miles to the Chesapeake from the New York area. Accompanied by Rochambeau's French army, Washington beset the British by land, while de Grasse blockaded them by sea after beating off the British fleet. Completely cornered, Cornwallis surrendered his entire force of 7,000 men on October 19, 1781, as his band appropriately played "The World Turned Upside Down." The triumph was no less French than American. The French provided essentially all the sea power and about half of the regular troops in the besieging army of some 16,000 men. Stunned by the news of disaster, Prime Minister Lord North cried, "Oh God, it's all over, it's all over!" But it was not. George III stubbornly planned to continue the struggle, for Britain was far from being crushed. It still had 54,000 troops in North America, including 32,000 in the United States. Washington returned with his army on New York, there to continue keeping a vigilant eye on the British force of 10,000 men. Fighting actually continued for more than a year after Yorktown, with Patriot-Loyalist warfare in the South especially savage. "No quarter for Tories," was the common battle cry. One of the Washington's most valuable contributions was to keep the languishing cause alive, the army in the field and the states together during these critical months. Otherwise, a satisfactory peace treaty might never have been signed. Peace at Paris. After Yorktown, despite George III's obstinate eagerness to continue fighting, many Britons were wary of war and increasingly ready to come to terms. They had suffered heavy reverses in India and in the West Indies. The island of Minorca and the Mediterranean had fallen. The rock of Gibraltar was tottering. Lord North's ministry collapsed in March 1782, temporarily ending the personal rule of George III. A Whig ministry, rather favorable to the Americans, replaced the Tory regime of Lord North. 3 American peace negotiators had meanwhile gathered at Paris. The aging but astute Benjamin Franklin, the flinty John Adams, vigilant for New England interests, and the impulsive John Jay of New York, deeply suspicious of the old world intrigue. The 3 envoys had explicit instructions from Congress to make no separate peace and to consult with their French allies at all stages of the negotiations. But the American representatives chafed under this directive. They knew well that it had been written by a subservient Congress, and with the French Foreign Office indirectly guiding the pen. France was in a painful position. It had induced Spain to enter the war on its side, in part by promising to deliver British-held Gibraltar. Yet the towering rock was defying frantic joint assaults by French and Spanish troops. Spain also coveted the immense Trans-Allegheny area, on which restless American pioneers were already settling. France, ever eager to smash Britain's empire, desired an independent United States, but one independent in the abstract, not in action. It therefore schemed to keep the new republic cooped up east of the Allegheny Mountains. A weak America, like a horse sturdy enough to plow but not vigorous enough to kick, would be easier to manage in promoting French interests in policy. France was paying a heavy price on the men and treasure to win America's independence, and it wanted to get its money's worth. But John Jay was unwilling to play France's game. Suspiciously alert, he perceived that the French could not satisfy the conflicting ambitions of both Americans and Spaniards. He saw signs, or thought he did, indicating that the Paris Foreign Office was about to betray Americans' Trans-Appalachian interests to satisfy those of Spain. He therefore secretly made separate overtures to London, contrary to his instructions from Congress. The hard-pressed British, eager to entice one of their enemies from the alliance, speedily came to terms with the Americans. A preliminary treaty of peace was signed in 1782, the final peace the next year. By the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the British formally recognized the independence of the United States. In addition, they granted generous boundaries stretching majestically to the Mississippi on the west, to the Great Lakes on the north, and to Spanish Florida on the south. Spain had recently captured Florida from Britain. The Yankees, though now divorced from the empire, were to retain a share in the priceless fisheries of Newfoundland. The Canadians, of course, were profoundly displeased. The Americans, on their part, had to yield important concessions. Loyalists were not to be further persecuted, and Congress was to recommend to the state legislators that confiscated Loyalist property be restored. As for the debts long owed to British creditors, the states vowed to put no lawful obstacles in the way of their collection. Unhappily for future harmony, the assurances regarding both Loyalists and debts were not carried out in the manner hoped for by London. As for Britain, its acceptance of defeat in North America eventually paid enormous strategic dividends. Persisting in the colonial conflict might well have bled Britain dry, but shutting down the war against the Americans enabled London to rebuild its army and navy and eventually prevail in its titanic struggle with Napoleon, and to become the preeminent world power in the 19th century. A new nation legitimized. Britain's terms were liberal almost beyond belief. The enormous Trans-Appalachian area was thrown in as a virtual gift, for George Rogers Clark had captured only a small segment of it. Why the generosity? Had the United States beaten Britain to its knees? The key to the riddle may be found in the Old World. At the time the peace terms were drafted, Britain was also trying to seduce America from its French alliance, so it made the terms as alluring as possible. The shaky Whig ministry, hanging on by its fingernails for only a few months, was more friendly to the Americans than were the Tories. It was determined, by a policy of liberality, to solve recent wounds, reopen old trade channels, and prevent future wars over the coveted Trans-Appalachian region. This far-sighted policy was regrettably not followed by successors of the Whigs. In spirit, the Americans made a separate peace, contrary to the French alliance. In fact, they did not. The Paris Foreign Office formally approved the terms of the peace, though disturbed by the lone wolf course of its American ally. France was immensely relieved by the prospect of bringing the costly conflict to an end and of freeing itself from its embarrassing promises to the Spanish crown. America alone gained from the world-girdling war. The British, though soon to stage a comeback, were battered and beaten. The French had savored sweet revenge, but plunged headlong down the slippery slope to bankruptcy and revolution. The Americans fared much better. Snatching their independence from the furnace of world conflict, they began their national career with a splendid territorial birthright and a priceless heritage of freedom. Seldom, if ever, have any people been so favored. Oh my god, varying viewpoints. Whose revolution? Okay, I don't think I'm gonna read this part because I have to go eat dinner. But I think it's probably one of those two different viewpoint kind of things. But yay, that was pages something to 157, 146 to 157. Yay!